like to welcome you all to the first plenary sessions of the IMCIC 16 Spring Conference. My job here is to introduce our speakers, and our first speaker is Scott Foote. Scott is a cybersecurity engineer at MITRE's National Security Engineering Center. FFRDC. I'm not exactly sure what that stands for. At MITRE, Scott is applying his extensive knowledge of software engineering, business operations management, enterprise scale information systems, information security, and open source threat intelligence to researching and developing solutions for today's enterprise scale cybersecurity challenges. Scott's involvement with cybersecurity began in the mid-1980s at Digital Equipment Corporation and has spanned both the commercial and public sectors ever since. In a number of commercial companies, including Oracle, OpenVision/Veritas, and a series of startups focused on the information security market. Scott is currently the lead for MITRE's Cyber Operations Center, CIOC, a capstone initiative, the lead for the company's Cyber Situation Awareness Initiative, chief engineer on a number of customer-focused cyber operations efforts, and contributed to several MITRE R&D projects addressing specific cyber operations needs, solutions, and deployments. So I'd like you all to welcome Scott Foote.
Thank you, Dr. Gill. Thank you, everybody. Good morning. Let me just address the FFRDC question, give you some perspective on the background. So the United States government has a concept of federally funded research and development centers. That's FFRDC. Essentially, we're nonprofit organizations. We work as an extension of the federal government, and our job is to do their needs analysis and to design solutions. We are actually constrained from building solutions. We cannot compete with industry, so we can't go and compete with a Raytheon or a Lockheed Martin, for example, to actually implement the system, but it is our job to do a lot of that upfront design work, to better analyze what the need is, to take it beyond something as simple as, go buy me XYZ, and to help design that solution if it doesn't exist commercially. We do often take it all the way into the operations where we help with the deployment and the rollout, training, fundamentally working to make sure it's successful and it doesn't wind up being essentially just shelfware. But as I said, we are constrained from doing the work that contractors can do. So at MITRE, I spent a lot of time with a variety of federal sponsors. We can chat a little bit later about a few of them, but it's not constrained to the typical defense community. At least my work isn't. MITRE's work is literally across the entire federal government. I'm going to talk about two major topics this morning. The first is going to be complexity, because of what we're constrained with today, because of the dynamic nature, because of the non-deterministic nature of the very large global systems that, in this case, the U.S. federal government depends upon. But frankly, most multinationals today are dealing with the exact same set of challenges in complexity. Complexity is getting away from people. It leaves them feeling a sense of chaos, a sense of urgency. And that's part of the needs analysis I'm going to speak to up front. The second is the problem space of cybersecurity. It is essentially a cybernetics topic, right? We're talking about regulatory systems where people are trying to control and better manage their own information and the communication of that information amongst each other. This is wrought with problems due to the complexity we just talked about a minute ago. So those are the two main topics, but the convergence is actually a point we were just chatting about over here at the table up front over breakfast, and that is helping people make decisions. Cybernetics control of that large system, helping people make the decisions on how best to deal with what is challenging their business or their organization, what is presenting ultimately risk. That's the convergence. I'm going to come back to that on my summary slide, but I want to jump in first with an introduction from 10 years ago when I left commercial industry and I joined MITRE and I came to speak to the government folks. Essentially, it started a lot like this. You guys are going to find this very familiar. Houston, we have a problem, and I don't mean familiar from the movie. I mean, you probably deal with this on a weekly basis. Organizations have fundamentally been compromised. I cannot think of a single one I deal with that has not been compromised in some way, shape, or form, government or commercial. Their statement to me, though, was simply this: we need cyber situation awareness. Now, being a security professional, I did not know what that term was. I had never heard it. In commercial industry, we don't use that term. So I asked for a little bit more depth. Can you explain a little bit more? Well, we think we need a SIM. Is a SIM the answer? Security Information Event Management. I said, I'm sorry, what was the question? Did I miss something in the conversation? You're presenting a solution to me, but you haven't really explained what it is you're trying to do yet. SIMs are wonderful, by the way. I own stock in almost every single SIM company that exists today, even the startups. Business isn't going away anytime soon. But can we be more specific about what the problem is? You're kind of abstract. You're really telling me what the solution is. I can't tell you whether that solution is relevant if I don't know what it is you're going to try to do with it. And if I don't know who is going to try to use it. Let's talk about some of the attributes of your need. Can we dig into that in a little bit more depth? Well, that's a bit of a challenge. The response is typically, you don't understand. I hear the chuckles. This is a weekly conversation. What don't I understand? We're in crisis. Yeah, I'm aware, I do read the press. Can you be a little bit more specific? Well, yes, we're in conflict. And in the case of the United States, we're in conflict with nation states, threat activists, lots of different organizations. Yes, read about it in the press all the time now. That's fascinating. Can we dig a little bit deeper than that? Well, essentially, we need to provide control over the environment. Contingencies, continuity of what it is we do, be it business, be it mission. We need our end users to have better confidence in the information that they rely upon so critically today. That's a great set of objectives. What's the plan? How are we going to move out and address that issue? Well, see, this complexity topic comes up all the time. We don't really know what we have. We have one of everything. Frankly, we have 10,000 of everything, and every version of everything behind that. The complexity is overwhelming to us. So we plan on reducing complexity as our first job. You plan on reducing complexity, but your problem is you're in conflict with an adversary that's exploiting you. Are they exploiting your complexity, or are they exploiting the vulnerability that's inherent in that complexity? All right, you're reducing complexity, commonality. How's that going for you? Well, maybe not so good. We can't get the community to provide any consensus, right? There's no compliance. There's nothing but internal conflict when we try to force everything to a common platform, because it's insufficient for 95% of the staff. Ultimately, we're in a state of chaos, bounded only by time and money. Those two hard problems of time and money. It's a difficult set of challenges that the organization is faced with. Let's see what we can do to help reduce some of that chaos. Let's start with some simplistic needs analysis. Being an FFRDC, I want to get into it with systems engineering. I want to help them to move from that abstract problem statement into something that's concrete that we can address, into a problem that we can actually present solutions against and measure the success or effectiveness, not efficiency, but effectiveness of those solutions. So let's start with that. Let's use some fundamental systems engineering. Let's do some decomposition. Let's decompose the problem into who is it you think is performing the job. What are they doing and why? The where, the when, and the how obviously are all important. So many folks, though, want to jump directly to how. Is SIM the answer? That's how we wound up on that far right. Is SIM the answer? They made assumptions that I was aware of all of the other W's here, and we haven't actually done the needs analysis. Let's just start with the how. Let's recognize that things don't happen magically. People execute processes that are enabled by technology, not technology in and of itself. Even in automation, we wind up seeing a lot of organizations say to me all the time, I want to automate things at my perimeter, automate the defense. I say, what do you want to automate? Well, I want to automate the defense. If you haven't had a person go through the process of providing the defense, you don't know what you're going to automate. We need to start with the end in mind. We need to understand people executing processes, enabling the technology. That's a novelty in the beginning. We mature it, it becomes a commodity, we can automate it, but we continue to move through this maturation process. It's not simply going to deploy the magic easy button and everything's going to be taken care of. So let's do some further decomposition of that. Being a systems engineer by trade and having applied to the security space, I like to start from the beginning. Let's start with our abstract. Who is doing what? Talk about your missions, your business processes, the mission-critical functions, the tasks, the procedures and activities. Talk about the information that supports them and the capabilities we use to both store, manage, and exchange that information. Now, understanding the functional and non-functional criteria, we can derive some level of design. We've got a concrete understanding of the problem. We can design the system. We can do functional allocation. Now we can start building a large system of systems, some of which we're going to be able to buy, some of which we need to build. At this point in time, if they're still awake, they'll just stop and shout at me, "You don't understand." Urgency, hair on fire. We don't have time to do all that. We don't have time to have the discipline of designing the solution to the problem. We need to move now. We need to put out fires immediately. All right. Well, is it better if we just guess? Because that's what happens a lot. People will deploy things. I get pulled in all the time. Someone has pulled a piece of technology up, and they've said, you know, we bought this and we made an X million dollar investment in the technology, and it's not working. So what did you think it would do? Well, we thought it would slice bread and make julienne fries. You made a lot of assumptions before you made the acquisition that this technology was somehow going to address an abstract need. You shouldn't be surprised if you're disappointed that it's not getting you there. Let's take a different tack. Let's talk about prototyping. If you don't have the patience, the sense of urgency is overwhelming, you can't get through this deliberate decomposition, let's actually do it a little bit more experientially. People do not like to read. I have written thousands of pages of ConOps and TTPs, more than anybody could possibly imagine they'd ever read in a lifetime. No one ever reads it. They admire this printed volume full of data. They want to experience it. They'll say, take me to a lab, I want to experience it. So the engineers will do the work of researching, documenting, developing with the operators in a DevOps kind of a mode, but while we're doing that, we're building, we're bringing technologies to the table and we're trying them out. We're doing it in small pieces to make sure we understand the need very discreetly, who's doing it, when are they, why, and then we help with the how. We enable that, and we revise our understanding. So we iterate on this. The product, yes, we still build all of that collateral. We do the documentation, but what's more important is we're changing the mindset of the end user. We're helping them to experience forward progress, and most importantly, we're eliminating those assumptions. The assumptions that they typically jump right over and wind up making the X million dollar investment for. People feel that sense of forward progress, that's a good thing. Eliminating assumptions for the engineers and the success of our operators is fundamental. So let's go back to the 6 questions, starting with the who. Who are we talking about enabling here? Who are they? What's their role? What's their responsibility? What authority and resources do they have? I have actually had people come to me with senior leaders, and they've said the senior leader needs to see a dashboard on a security and event manager. I'll say, why? That's not what a senior leader wants. A senior leader wants a decision. Give them a decision space and help them to understand the trades in the decision. They do not want to see raw data. Your CFO doesn't bring to the CEO all of the things in the general ledger. Here are the 10 million transactions over last month. Let's walk through every single one of them. No, he brings you the balance sheet, the cash flow, understanding where you are in terms of liabilities, and some decision to be made. Take out a loan, sell some equity. That's where we need to get to with an understanding of who's the end user for this. Now, what are they trying to do? Fundamentally, they're all trying to make decisions. There are 2 folks that I work with. Current operators that are putting out fires. They're taking an action today. They're changing an ACL on a firewall. They're trying to deal with a compromise in situ. They're watching things be exfiltrated. On the right-hand side, though, is the acquisition space. Their job is to think about next year into the future. They're buying the technology that will be deployed over the course of the coming years. They're both making decisions. They're both making investment decisions, and frankly, they're both doing it poorly because they're doing it with insufficient understanding of what's going on. Their context is a mess because it's wrought with the complexity we talked about. Why are they making decisions? One reason only. They're all driving down risk. They're trying to mitigate risk to their organization. The risk of compromise, breach, confidentiality, worst of all, violated integrity, certainly availability, but that's a mundane problem. We've been dealing with that since the 60s. Reactive or proactive, they're all trying to drive that risk out. The vast majority are still reacting. We all know what the current course of circumstances are in the press. We're trying to get people to be more proactive. We're trying to get them to recognize it's not if you will be compromised, it is when, and how will you deal with it when you are compromised. How are they making those decisions? This brings us back to situational awareness. I need situational awareness. Is SIM the answer? Well, let's break situational awareness down a little bit and make that a little bit more concrete. Fundamentally, situational awareness is about events in context, and context is knowledge. This is what's missing when I typically show up, which is odd because I'm usually the guy that's reading a packet header in some TCP packet. But I look to them and say, you're making a decision based on the web, the raw event stream, which we can bring to you with technology today. You don't have any context. Sometimes the mitigations they're putting in place are worse to their end user than what the problem was to begin with. I have countless examples of that in the space over the last 10 years. So in the knowledge space, we have two fundamental things we need to worry about. The first is observation. That's fact. I have a particular packet, data is leaving this particular port on that particular machine. That's a fact. The second is inference. Inference is what I have in terms of knowledge about that system. I know the system is supposed to communicate over that port at this point in time. I understand it's fully expected, or it's anomalous. Without the ability to build and maintain inferences, that context, there's no ability to recognize what is or isn't anomalous. Let's talk briefly about the knowledge bases. Knowledge bases are fundamental in terms of moving that context and community experience forward. It's not just data, it's context. It's not just information, it's the mental models we all have in terms of how things work in this complex domain. Complexity is fundamental in being able to manage it. It's about experience. The experience of having put out those fires. When I usually engage with somebody, I'll talk to a senior leader first, and then I'll say, who's your best firefighter? I want to go talk to the person who's put out the most fires, has the worst stories to tell about their experience, because I want to hear about their knowledge. That's the person that's played Apollo 13 and shown up understanding his portion of the complexity. Lastly is the deliberate knowledge management. We spend a lot of time in FFRDCs helping our customers do this. Baseline their environment, understand what they have today, and then maintain it. There is an overwhelming resistance to doing this. It takes time. It takes discipline. Frankly, it's not very exciting to write things down. But the baselining and that continuous evolution is fundamental to maintaining the context. They'll ask me all the time, what is the value proposition? I need to go talk to the boss. Why should I be doing this? And I just give them one answer. Because your adversary is doing it too. If it's important to your adversary, it better be important to you. How do you think they're producing the effects on your business? They're doing reconnaissance. They're building their contextual knowledge base because they don't want to waste their resources. If it's important to them, it should be important to you. So let's talk about knowledge. First is observation. Second is inference. Who can tell me what they see on the right-hand side? That front table looks kind of suspect. Maybe one of you guys can tell me. What is that picture on the right-hand side? Go ahead, just blurt something out. Actions. Good. Anybody else? Actions. Anybody see a person? Say again? I still can't hear you. Emergency exit. Oh, I like that one. That's good. This is a good audience. You guys are thinking more abstractly. So I typically get things like that man running. And I'll say, running from what? How do you know he's running from? Maybe running to the emergency exit. How do you know this isn't someone dismounting a ladder? Well, those of you that maybe have not enough coffee, maybe it's someone swimming. Could be. The point is, we all add something. There's nothing there but a symbol, right? The fact is there's a symbol. The inference is what we bring to the table. That's an excellent observation. Action. We see someone taking action. It could be to exit. It could be a sense of emergency. It could just be because Starbucks showed up with free coffee. But that inference is fundamental to understanding what's going on in the environment. Let's talk now about knowledge management for a minute. Tom Davenport, actually an instructor of mine back in the 90s at Babson College, he introduced this process of knowledge management. He talked about capturing, developing, sharing, effectively using information. Speaks directly to this world of cybernetics. He also talked about the processes we use, the storytelling of Native Americans, for example, tribal knowledge, what gets passed from the elders down to the next generation of decision makers, communities of interest such as this one today. How we share and we move that knowledge base forward is important. But we're trying to institutionalize that and actually support it with systems. This is my knowledge base. In my knowledge base, I'm building a system, data, context, information, mental models. Let's break mental models down for a second and talk about how we maintain those. I talk about a series of primitives. Scott knows Naguib. That's a primitive. There are two facts, and there's a third fact in the middle that is a relation between them. RDF from W3C talks about this as a triple: subject, predicate, object. I bring this up because as we start to build a knowledge base online, we're going to start with these primitives. We're going to start by building facts and inference together into a very large knowledge base. That knowledge base in my world looks a little bit like this. You can imagine I've been doing this since 1981, collected some bit of clutter in terms of fact, and you can imagine what my garage looks like too. I still have a microvac sitting in my storage room. My wife calls it the support center. In my storage room, it's actually microvacs with serial number 1 on it from sometime in the 80s. All of that is kind of useless, right? All of those facts are useless until we connect them. Those lines are the inferences. Those lines give the bits of data meaning, put it in context. That is why someone goes to a 45-year-old to fight the fire in cyberspace rather than a 25-year-old. Not that the 25-year-old doesn't have skill, but the 45-year-old has been there. That's the reason why I asked for that firefighter. Why I go to that person who's had the worst experience in the company, because I want to extract, I want to learn from that experience. The triple store is what the RDF would call this, a triple store being a collection, of course, storage of triples. We're going to talk about exactly that. We're going to talk about graph theory and how we've begun to build these knowledge bases in large directed graphs that can be used operationally. They can be used to train new staff. They can be used to transition to succession as people come up through the chains. They can be used to drive investments, which is what I use it for, proactive or reactive investments. So what kind of knowledge is going to go in this knowledge store? Well, in the cybersecurity space, we talk about risk. There's an old risk formula. It was actually by a guy named John Lane who used to work with me years and years ago. Threat, vulnerability, and consequence. There's been a lot of different perturbations over this over time. But if you really look at this, fundamentally what we're talking about are some of those triples, those primitives. Threat exploits vulnerability, which results in a consequence. And actually, if you look a little bit deeper, you'll see the vulnerability is part of a system that supports a mission or a business process and ultimately results in some consequence. We want to be able to take this apart. We want to be able to capture information about this that allows us to operationalize the knowledge bases that I mentioned a minute ago. We want to be able to show an impact down here at the bottom. Some threat is materialized. I've had some type of an exposure. You've probably all dealt with it, right? We've had some, let's use exfil. We've had some piece of information, personal information has left the organization, like Target. What's the impact to us? If you ask Target that, you might think that they would tell you about what's going on with the number of customers. They won't. They'll tell you what they think they lost in terms of brand recognition and how it dropped in their top line revenue. That's what they talk about in terms of the consequence. The event happened, it resulted in some impact to the business. This is the situation awareness that people ask about. This is what they're looking for. What my customers want to know is that top line, what was the impact? Not the bottom line, tell me about the 10 billion events that happened in the last hour. But reality is complex, right? Reality is a lot more complex than a few triples. In this space, this is a mission decomposition, obviously trivialized. Those missions, those activities depend on information, which depends on infrastructure. That infrastructure is incredibly complex today. Somebody asked me recently about a web-based system. They said, can you send me the program? I said, I know you're over 42 because you used the word program. You thought I was going to send you an executable. It's a web app. There are containers, a web app, an app server, web server, database server. There's all kinds of infrastructures, multiple protocols. No concept of the complexity of what had been built in that particular system. But we also have threat actors that are exploiting this. They're exploiting that complexity. This is not new, but it is certainly more visible today than it's ever been. At some point, a few years back, maybe 6 or 7 years back, I was helping one of our sponsors sort out their knowledge base, and I said, look, fundamentally, you have network, mission, and threat information. We categorized it that. The good news is the federal government now uses those 3 categories to talk about the investment in building knowledge bases and baselining and maintaining their knowledge bases. They said, well, it's new, right? The purple and the blue, that's new. I said, no, it's not new. Enterprise architects have been doing this for decades. We have all kinds of frameworks that we use in the government, we use in industry. The bottom line is there is a discipline to maintain that knowledge base. What is new is the fact that we don't introduce into enterprise architecture the concept of the bad guy. Enterprise architecture, everything's good, right? When you close the books is what happens here. All systems, everything behaves itself. So, a few exceptions, some conditionals, but ultimately everything's good. Everything is not good in the cybersecurity domain. We need to add that level of information to the concept of enterprise architecture, which is what we do. So let's talk about prototyping, because people don't have the patience to sit and read all of this. How are we going to get them to experience it? Let's bring those three things together in a prototypical system. Let's start to bring knowledge into a knowledge base, and let's show them the discipline of knowledge management, not just how to do it, but the value. How do I communicate to my leadership why this is important? If the bad guy's doing it, why shouldn't I be doing it? Here's why you should be doing it. In 2008, we used something called Improvise. It's open source, but it's not freely shared. We used this platform and we started to build these directed graphs. We started to derive from missions the tasks, the information that they depend upon, and the systems and networks that support them. This is a trivialized graph. In fact, this is nothing more than a cartoon, but the software was real, and we stood it up and we began to build models for our end users. And we showed them what we on the outside as engineers could find very quickly through open source and how we could enable decisions, either good guy decisions or bad guy decisions, but we demonstrated the value of that kind of a knowledge base back then. Things have moved forward considerably. We started to blend in the vulnerability. Understanding what those systems were, we looked at the vulnerability auditing. Not that everybody does it sufficiently, but this is where I was in the early 1990s, actually, one of the first vulnerability auditing tools in the world, called SecureMax. We were making some money, but we just couldn't convince people that it was a problem. There weren't enough exploits, there weren't enough compromises being visible. But vulnerability is one of the first things that people deal with today, and then we connected the attacks to it. First we said, what if? What if that zero-day exploits your vulnerability? Look at what it's going to do to your mission. Then we started talking about what was really happening. Things get very classified at that point, right? People want to contain that information. But the bottom line is we showed the art of the possible. Starting from that trivialized little graph, where we are today is we have a lot more complexity. What I do on a daily basis is I help sponsors with their decisions by building knowledge bases. That knowledge base in the lower right-hand corner, that's a real knowledge base. It's not classified, that's the unclassified version of it, but that is just for one of my sponsors, to show you the density and the complexity of their environment. But when you zoom in up close over here on the left-hand side, you see it's nothing more than a collection of triples. And it's not one person that manages it. Often they'll say, my goodness, how will I ever do that? You won't do it. That's back to the who question. The community will do it. The appropriate people are the appropriate authorities, but the community self-populates what they know about their environment. They connect the dots. They build that complexity. From the complexity, we can now drive awareness. So let me show you just a quick snapshot of some awareness. There are three screens. Those are my three lines of business up on the left-hand side. Can anybody here tell me which of those I should be paying most attention to right now? I know, no text, right? There's no context. At least you don't see context. Nobody? So the one on the left has an awful lot of yellow and orange to it, right? Quite a bit of real estate there. The one in the middle, some red, but orange in the center. The one on the far right there, far less orange and red, well, less orange and red, but it's red in the center. That means it's gotten to the top of my organization. I've set my perspective on that graph on one of the resources, and I've said, show me the dependencies for this resource. That's what you see played out in the sunburst in the radial dial. Those are the dependencies of the thing in the middle, which is, as I said, my line of business. Could be anything. Could be a task, function, could be an individual, could be an objective. In this case, they are my lines of business. That one on the right, whatever's happening may seem trivial when you get all the way out to the edge in the weeds of the systems and networks, but it's propagating and having a fundamental impact at my level of business. That's going to get my attention. This is just one of the ways we're beginning to show folks that they extract awareness from the context. Understanding can only come from contextual knowledge. It's not software. Software will enable, but it doesn't do it for you. So we've had quite a bit of success in building this, but now what I wind up doing is I take people through a process of maturation, and I say, look, we all start at the bottom monitoring data. We all want to know what we should collect, what we should instrument, where should we put our sensors. Then we start to realize, wow, we're getting a lot of data. We need to do some statistical analysis. The humans can't eat it fast enough. We really have to engage more with heuristics and trends. That's good. Most of us have graduated through that. Certainly Fortune 500, most governments are certainly at this point in time. Then we start to think about reporting and sharing. Who am I going to share with? I need to share laterally, I need to share vertically. Back to the point about bringing the boss 10 million events. That's not what the boss wants to see. They want to see an assessment of impact. Further up, we talk about the ability to assess it and put it in context. This is where mission, network, and threat comes in. The government talks about it in terms of cyber key terrain or key terrain cyber. It's mission critical systems. In business, we talk about them as mission critical systems. And ultimately, we're trying to drive those decisions about risk. I have to confess, most of the folks I work with, even in industry today, have not passed over the center bar here in the middle. They are still struggling with what's at the bottom. For one reason that is consistent across all of them is that they're trying to buy a solution, they're not trying to design a solution. They haven't taken the time to understand their needs. Big data, I used to be an Oracle RDBS engineer years and years ago. Fascinating job. I'll bore you to tears about it another time. But the point is, we've never had anything but big data. Right? In that space, we've never dealt with anything but big databases. What we need here is not big data, it's quality data. I need the right data. I don't need noise. I don't want to Fourier transform through 10 billion events. I want somebody to bring me the impact to say, it's the nation state of XYZ, it's the hacktivist ABC. I want them to put it in context of the threat and what's the impact of my business. That's the kind of awareness that we're trying to get them to. So what have we talked about again? Complexity. We've talked about trying to reduce the chaos to a sense of order that's manageable. Doing that needs analysis. We've talked about moving from abstract, I feel urgency and pain, to something concrete. Start to populate a knowledge base with facts. Get your players together. Build and share over time. We've talked about the decomposition that's so fundamental to moving across that. We've talked about the cybersecurity space and that awareness depends on knowledge of risk, threat, vulnerability, and consequence. We've even talked about using technology like graphs and triple stores to populate that knowledge base, but it comes back to let's experience it now. Don't just write about it, let's experience it. Put the operator in the seat, have them experience the ability to make these decisions that they've only dreamed about in the past. That is exactly where we get engagement, when we do all of that upfront work and people are, frankly, they're bored to tears watching us read log files or watching me read hexadecimal dumps, crash dumps. Ultimately, we get them down to this point. Answers to real questions, and those questions are really business decisions. How do you keep supporting those business decisions? And it's a managed evolution. Every one of them wants to buy something today because urgency. We've spent decades building this infrastructure. It's not going to be completely well managed overnight. It's going to take time. With that, thank you guys for your attention. Hopefully I woke you up a little bit today. Usually I walk around. I try to do this as kind of a TED-style brief, rather than my charts full of data. But I'm going to be around. I guess we're going to do Q&A, Dr. Gill, at the end of the 3 briefings. So thank you very much.